Welcome, everybody. We have the pleasure of hearing from Yeewan Koon today. Yeewan is one of our fellows until July.
Yes, I'm here
She's
for a
going to
while.
be here. She comes from the University of Hong Kong and is well familiar to New York, actually, with her PhD at the IFA, as far as I recall, on the 19th century painter. Was it Suran Chan?
Yes.
Your dissertation paper as well. So she's here on a Fulbright fellowship, and she'll be talking about her current research project on Canton painting. The title of her talk today is Chinese Canton, making an album of things. So welcome.
Thanks, Bonsoir. I should begin by saying I'm recovering from a cold, so halfway I'll be blowing my nose throughout all of this. I'm really sorry about that. I will try to power through. So before I begin with my paper, I thought I'd explain or talk a little bit about what my bigger project is and how this particular paper fits in. I'm going to read, just partly, again, having this very heavy head. It makes it a little easier. So let me start. I'm working on a book that aims to present a more focused case study approach on 18th and 19th century China trade art within the larger context of Guangzhou, which is in Southeast China, China and maritime Asia. Given the sheer quantity of trade art objects, catalogues, and collections there are around the world, I'm hoping that this case study approach can narrow the scope with the aim of pushing the boundaries of current scholarship on China trade art itself. My key goal is to examine how distance, as a conceptual and physical boundary in cross-cultural interactions, was a crucial element in the making and reception of objects and images. Moreover, the element of distance was instrumental in creating Canton, a site that we now accept as a geographical location of fixed point, but was in its own time a space that was neither defined nor limited to geography. Some of you may hear echoes of Jennifer Roberts' recent book, Transporting Vision, and her work has certainly helped me think through some of my ideas. By distance, I mean to examine the different strategies used to maximize the experiential potential of elsewhereness, which I argue is the most important criteria of Canton trade art. These are works to be seen elsewhere, but how is that preemption of elsewhereness expressed? I'm still working on the implication of these strategies and how they impact the way that we think about material culture and of painting itself, which is really my main training. I certainly welcome any feedback and future conversations. In today's talk, which is actually drawn from a chapter in a book that's just hot off the press, and my apologies for my shameless plug here, but which I will be expanding on. And in fact, I'm actually moving into a slightly different direction from the chapter that I have in this particular book. I tackled the issue of distance in this particular section, slightly different from my other chapters, by thinking about where is the starting point. This turned out to be a trickier question than expected, for before I can begin with where, I had to begin with what is the starting point. So what is Canton? So this is an image of Canton. It's a much later image of Canton. Canton itself, essentially, which one's the pointer? It's this one, okay. Canton itself essentially is just this teeny tiny area outside of the city wall. This is the main city wall itself. This is the old city. This part includes the new city, but it's just a little strip. And at one stage, in particular in the period I'm talking about, it's no more than about 10 meters long in length. It's a very small stretch of land. But it has this, and it was partly because of this. It's a small stretch of place, but that seemed to be much bigger in its scope, which was of interest to me, in defining what it is. So the word Canton itself is based on the 16th century Portuguese iteration of Guangdong, or Guangdong, as it is spoken in Cantonese pronunciation. But it is a word that has become so ubiquitous that it is a term that is still used today to define the people, the language, being Cantonese as I am, and sometimes the place of Guangdong itself. In export trade scholarship, it is regarded as a contact zone between China and the West and an important maritime trading hub in the 18th century. It was a place that produced export artworks that were distinctive for their hybrid style that combined Chinese images, real and imagined, for an eager audience across the seas. In terms of art history, most studies provide assessment that are based on a sliding scale of hybridity of how a China is packaged for a West. And this is just to give you something to look at, the kind of work that came out. Which bits of the work is Chinese, which bits is not, which bits are sort of Chinese, but Chinese-like, etc. But underscoring these questions are always a bigger question of how much a concept of China is being adapted for a foreign audience and how it compares and often fails against the West. However, analysis of production based on reception is itself problematic if our research interest lies not just in the nature of the encounter, but the material conditions of the encounter. I should qualify here that research on production based on reception is the primary mode of investigation because we can find a lot more information in English and European language materials, as this type of work is barely registered as being part of a larger Chinese work. I should say here that the study of export art also began with Western collectors. I should also add that Guangdong is the term that's used to describe traditional ink painting world, and Canton is used to talk about China trade art. So they're almost treated as two separate worlds in itself. It's sort of never the twine should meet, Guangdong and Canton. The usual gamut of questions one might want to ask, such as who made the artworks, how were they made, how were they transported, etc., are difficult to answer beyond the snippets of anecdotal information that are available from foreign visitors. We can't really track any true, very strong quantitative data. Although I do want to take a slight, to counter my own argument by looking just very quickly at these two images. The one on the left is actually an earlier image. The one on the right is a 19th century image. You can see from the similarity of the figures itself that they actually probably came from the same master template. They're very similar in terms of what they're trying to do. The face looks rather similar, but they're very different. The one on the left, which you can also see, is how there's an incredible disproportion of sizes and scale there. What that would suggest that maybe that different people were involved in depicting different sections of the artworks, that there was a module system here at work. One of the things that I find particularly interesting about this particular image here is how there's no feet, which is very odd. Once you start noticing there's no feet, it becomes a very odd image. But for those of you who are familiar with Chinese art, what is actually this particular image of someone who's seated in a cross-legged position with no feet, carrying, in this case, a scepter of some sort in its hand, is actually drawn based on Buddhist art. It's a Buddha figure. And for a lot of the people in these workshops, what we do know is that because there was only a market for half the year, the other half the time, because the boats were only arrived, the ships were only arrived for half a year. So the other half of the year, what these people will be producing will work for the local market. What we do know that ink painting, in terms of the local market, one of the biggest production was actually of Buddhist art itself, which may just explain why there may be these weird overlaps coming here between export art and Buddhist artwork here as well for this particular. So we can get some, but we can't get a lot of information is what I'm trying to suggest. Nonetheless, these are questions that are continuously asked. I cannot tell you the number of dissertations and writings that we still have, and myself have included, with the hope that somehow it is buried in the many tomes of books. If only we search that little bit more, the needle in a haystack research method for that elusive golden ticket. I must admit that I too have gone down many paths that have resulted in dead ends, including what I thought was ingenious at the time, which was the investigation of household taxes, because craftsmen are taxed differently. But this also yielded little fruit in that we don't have consistent data available to actually create a solid picture of how things were done. So my paper today picks up from these ashes of many frustrated attempts of trying to dig deeper into thinking about what this world was like. So instead of asking those questions, I ask instead, what happens when we try to locate Canton from a local perspective and ask how the world of Canton and the Chinese local world intersected? I started this presentation today by asking what is Canton, but really what I'm asking is there a Guangdong Canton? How did the people who lived, worked, and had the most direct engagement with its neighbour outside the walls engage with the trading hub? This allows me to move away from a China-West engagement of export art, which is the traditional framework of looking at these things, to a more triangular network of Guangdong, China, and international trade. Did the rise in export painting production actively frame a regional Guangzhou identity that differentiated it from other parts of China and spoke to its position as a global center? The focus of my dissertation is a manuscript album of 33 images of costume figures in the Peabody Essex Museum. The album, elegantly bound in red leather with gold embossed decoration, has a bookplate identifying it as part of the collection of Thomas Philip, Earl the Grey of West Park in Bedfordshire, England. As Thomas Philip Robinson assumed the title of Earl the Grey in 1833, the book was in his collection from at least that date. On the flyleaf, a handwritten note identifies an earlier owner, and the quote is, "I brought these Chinese drawings for 16 guineas at the auction for Mr. Martin, the supercargo effects in March 1747, P. York." It has not been possible to trace who Mr. Martin is, but the date of 1747 makes this the earliest dated Canton trade album of watercolors, and decades before watercolor paintings presented as a serial set become a popular item for export. A strong argument can be made that P. York was Philip York, uncle of Thomas Philip. The family had a long connection with connecting Chinese-style things. Philip York's sister, Elizabeth, was married to George Anson, a naval officer who published his famous Voyage Around the World in 1748, seen by some scholars as marking a turning point in imperialist narratives of China. Jemima York, who's the Peter York Sr.'s daughter and aunt of Thomas Philip, commissioned a Chinese pagoda at West Park, and the Ansons also built a pagoda at Shrewsbury with the same garden designer, Thomas Wright. These may be names that some of you may have heard before. The album, and this is what makes it so unusual, has 4 small handwritten papers bound between the covers, and the first page includes a list of contents and notes by York Sr., recounting his attempts to learn about the figures in the album. He finds some unlikely help, and this is just part of it. Chekwa, a Chinese modeler who was in England in 1769, read and explained the characters in this book, which he said, more in the Mandarin language, exactly like the missionaries. And he lists some of the people that he talks about. York's Chinese modeler is this guy, Tan Chekwa, also known in England as Chekwa or Chekwa, who unlawfully, by switching ships without permission, landed in England in 1769. Arriving in England, Chekwa made his living making clay portrait figurines, a type of art that flourished in Canton at this time. He continued with this craft and charged 10 guineas for a bust and 15 for a whole-length sculpture in London. What is astonishing about how this Chinese artisan made his mark in England in 1770 was that he also showed his work at the Royal Academy. He was even included in a group portrait of Royal Academicians by Joan Sophony. You see him there, right at the very back. Can you see it? He's right there at the bottom. If York's records can be used as an indicator of Chekwa's knowledge, it is clear that the Chinese sculptor was neither familiar with Chinese classical histories nor equipped with the type of education expected of literary men. He was, however, literate. He had a generalized knowledge of histories, gleaned from folktales and popular novels. It is likely that he represents the typical social class of art makers in Canton who could read, write, up to a point, and probably was educated in community schools set up by local community leaders. I say that he could only write up to a point because there are a lot of writing mistakes in this particular text itself. The pen album's content list was written in French with the help of French missionaries who were also consulted, and in general the list dictates the order of the book. Each item is first listed where possible by transliteration. This is the list itself, as we see here. By transliteration of the Chinese characters written on a small red label, as you can see there. There's a little small red label. Unfortunately, some of the title slips are now missing, leaving a few figures anonymous. They seem to have been missing even at the time when York Sr. actually consulted the missionaries. Because according to some of the lists, the content list, if they are missing, what they would do is that the content list would describe what the character is rather than say what they are itself, which was interesting to see how they actually describe some of these figures. According to the list, there were originally 34 images, 3 were actually missing when the book was bound together, but 2 more were added at the end, and these 2 works are very rigid in composition and lack the finesse of the other images and are likely part of the original. The history of this album in England prompts the question of whether it was intended for a European audience. The strongest argument that was made for a Western viewer comes from examining the work as a complete album, and one in which the organization of the figures is in an order that would have been alien to a Chinese audience. For example, the album begins with a Taoist nun, and this is a Taoist nun. It's a rather unusual looking Taoist nun. A figure who is included, if included in any traditional Chinese text, would have appeared at the end. Women are always included at the end, along with monks and nuns. There are also many images of women in this album, almost equal in number to men, which again would have been an unusual feature in Chinese illustrated books. At the very least, we can conclude that in album form, this is not intended for a Chinese viewer, although we cannot rule out the possibility that individual images may have had domestic appeal. Ultimately, this question of a Western audience rests on the assumption that there is a direct China-West relation inherent in the object that can be used to assess the relationship between the Western European viewer and the Chinese maker. But such an approach involves a reading of the ideological effects of the subject of the album and asks what work they perform, which, while useful, leads us to methods that again erases the agency of the artist in relationship with the artwork. It's always about how it's being received as opposed to what is actually being made from the position of the learning and training of who the artist is. To shift the question away from reception to one of production, I essentially approach the album with 2 aims. I look at how the subjects are formed by a pictorial bricolage that speaks to networks as misaligned connections rather than direct translations. The second aim, and this is more a proposal than an aim, I suppose, is what if this is not an album of figures? What if this is an album of things? So let me backtrack slightly. This album is currently catalogued as an album of costumes of China at the Peabody Essex Museum, placing the book within the genre of costume books that were popular in the late 18th century that introduced far-flung places to Euro-American audiences. I have discussed this elsewhere. This is the kind of book that we're talking about. This is from a page that would have been far more typical. But let me summarize very quickly. These costume albums distill the image of China as an unchanged place, fixed in time, where people could be organized into social types that reflected a nation that could never modernize. It was in the late 18th century, with the failure of the Macartney mission to gain favorable trading terms, and when the infamous Kowtow incident marked an important shift in Sino-British relationship. Basically, Lord Macartney refused to kowtow to the emperor. The possession of knowledge, and more importantly, the claiming of that knowledge, was supported by the publication of works such as these album of figures, where the repetition and consistency of this pictorialization created a standardized visual language that connected the figures to the same space and used similarity to convey an objectivity that fitted a pseudo-documentary ambition. The Peabody Essex album, however, predates this popular genre of Chinese trade art, and is pictorially at odds with costume album conventions. The individual leaves of the album vary the treatment of the scale of the figures, colors, spatial compositions. These are some of the images that we have. And they also situate each of these figures in different scenes, giving them a sort of narrative context, which we do not have with the other standard album of costumes of China. Moreover, the figures are drawn from novels, history, even current figures, with some being specific characters, others more generic, and some that are specifically about Guangdong. So there's a greater variety of types here, which don't belong to the traditional format. An example of this is this figure. This is a portrait of a merchant in official dress, a blue gown and hat with a red tassel. Behind our merchants are bolts of silks and cases wrapped in embroidered cloths with patterns of mythical cloths. If these are items that are made for export, there are also imported items here, including a piece of red coral branch, a European fork. I don't know whether you can see those, or you can see that that's there. There's some glasses there, and 2 glass goblets. The import of red coral begins as early as the Western Han. So we're talking about the earliest written textual evidence we have is 81 BCE, where it came from the Mediterranean Sea and was considered a young object, an object from across the seas, but specifically the southwest. However, there were also local corals that were found among the ocean reefs found in Fujian, which is the province right next door to Guangdong, Taiwan, and Guangdong itself. It is also a type of material object that's long associated with Buddhism, and in the Qing dynasty, it was an item highly prized by the emperor, used for court necklaces as well as decorative potted landscapes. And these were presented as tribute gifts from Guangdong to the emperor during a similar time period. We actually don't know when these were presented, but it should be roughly around the same period of mid-18th century. Glass, likewise, has a long history, but here is a type of clean, clear glass, prized for the clean as frost, clear as water, which will identify this as being Western glass as opposed to Chinese local production glass. Guangdong was a big producer of glass, but their glass tend to be slightly darker in tone. It was made from a particular kind of crystal, and there's a reason why it's dark, because it's supposed to protect your eyes. It's not necessarily because it was about sunglasses, but more to do with it had yang qualities which will help deflect yin qualities. All of this is to refer to the fact that it captures here a history of foreign trade. So it's not just foreign trade at that moment in time, but also its history, looking at the coral itself, and the traffic of exotic goods. Sorry, although this image appears to be a straightforward descriptive image of a merchant, let me go back. The maker has flouted Chinese pictorial conventions, which must have added an element of strangeness that fit in with the more local narrative of marginal Guangdong. I do not go into this so much in this presentation, but it's what I'm working on at the moment, which is that this idea of strangeness is an important element that connects the world of Guangdong and Canton. That being exotic has always been part of its long history of a cosmopolitan identity, where Guangdong is seen as a place where odd things happen. And the idea of seeing foreigners and barbarians was part of this history of odd things happening in Guangdong. But let me return to why more specifically there are some unusual aspects of this image. First, the merchant is surrounded by items of trade, including an abacus, scales, and stacked piles of rattan trades used for drying tea leaves or mulberry leaves, which, as a display of the professional side of commerce, transgresses Chinese portraiture practices. You're not supposed to portray what you work as. Another unusual characteristic, and far more unusual characteristic, is how the merchant is depicted within walled interiors. The more common way of depicting men in interiors are often in spaces such as this, where walls are only implied. The interior scene is a type of composition more familiar in images of women, who, when seen within her private quarters, added a dimension of voyeuristic titillation. Can the same be seen here of our merchant? And there's something about the way that he is posing, with his leg cross-legged and looking this sideward long glance and looking down, is also a very typical posture that we see with representations of women than we do of men itself. If again we go back to this much more typical image of men at leisure, this is a rather unusual, almost a feminine depiction of the merchants. On the whole, however, it is the inclusion of the many figures derived from their then contemporary novels and dramas that differentiate this album from later costume types. One such character, and mentioned by York in his conversation with Chek Kwa, is this guy. He is a popular hero, Qiu Renke, from a 10th century short story, the biography of the Dragonbeard Guest, which was then adapted into an opera called Dragonbeard Elder, and which by the 18th century, when this was depicted, this tale was celebrated as the very first wuxia or knight-errant story, which was a very popular type of tales at that moment in time. Now, aside from Dragonbeard, there was also his protege Li Jing and Li Jing's wife, also known as Lady with the Red Sleeves. A well-known character in her own right, she will later appear in the 18th century tour de force novel Dream of the Red Chamber. I think she makes an appearance in this book. She's not actually identified as her, but I think this is who this is in this particular book itself. There are also figures in the album that spoke directly to, that would have appealed to a Guangdong audience. Gentleman Fan, who is this guy, was a political advisor who famously devised a successful plot by sending a beautiful woman to seduce their enemy, the King of Wu. Entrapment by seduction is a popular narrative, and the story is old as time. And this story was no exception and was included again in one of the most popular novels in Chinese history, Romance of the Three Kingdoms, considered one of the 4 great novels in Chinese history. And this is the beauty. What is unusual in the version that was very popular in the 18th century is that Fan Li will later marry the beauty, and together they will leave the political world, and Fan will become a merchant. An unusual choice, given that merchants were generally not highly regarded, and but this would have appealed to the many mercantile audiences living in Guangzhou. So this idea of a heroic Guangdong, again, is not unusual. We see a bit more of that later on as well. If the maker of the Peabody Essex album was drawing on Chinese novels and opera for his figures, his depth extended to pictorial presidents. Since the 17th century, illustrations and printed images expanded the visual world of books and opened up literary texts to those outside what was usually an exclusive world of educated scholar. This image in the Peabody Essex Museum album is perhaps the closest depth to a printed image here. This is of a scholar, and here we see almost a direct copy of a book which was printed in 1722 of Jude Miller. There are many other images here, I won't go into them, that will have roots in Chinese pictorial traditions. What they show is an active circulation of pictures, and in particular the importance of the printed book as an active circulation, as a carrier of pictorial information. It is perhaps not surprising that Guangdong was one of the major centers for commercial publication and had the 3rd highest number of bookshops in China. It was also the place to go if you wanted to get a cheap book made. You will go to Guangdong, in part because it had cheap labor. There's a whole region of using illiterate women as carvers. It was the cheapest way. They would literally carve text, even though they were illiterate. They were able to carve lots of very, very complicated classical text there as well, just by sheer copying. And a lot of people from Beijing and Jiannan will go down to Guangdong just to have their books published in this particular area. Another important source is the vernacular paintings of beautiful women, or what we call the Mei Ren Hua. During the 18th century, this type of painting, often in hanging scroll format, was associated with urban centers in Jiannan regions, known for their pleasure quarters. So we talk about Suzhou, Hangzhou, which is in the inland of China. However, this genre was appropriated later by Qing court, who made such paintings for the emperor and his immediate family. So this is the one here. Is in Guangdong. This is the type that you will get in Suzhou, and this is one that was actually made for the emperor, or before he became an emperor, he was a prince at this moment in time. This is an example of how the court turned to aesthetic taste of urban spaces, and it highlights the porous nature of influences of art making in 18th century Qing China. While the court versions of beauties were of significantly high quality in both skill and material, all of these images follow a very basic compositional arrangement where a woman waits for her husband or her lover in an inner space surrounded by layers of different rooms and gardens that peep out from behind. Our Canton beauty, so typical of all the others that were circulating in Jiannan and in court, suggests that we must add 18th century Guangdong, and by extension the West, to a growing network of city, court, port transfers. Now, this is particularly significant for those of us who work in Chinese art history, because what I'm proposing is another inter-regional circuit for paintings that disrupts the canonical approach to Chinese ink paintings that only favors a Jiannan, Beijing, and inland China circuit. The comparison of figurative works may demonstrate how Chinese trade artists drew upon local practices and visual knowledge to make works for a global audience. It does not, on its own, explain why it matters. Looking beyond pictorial citations to turn to the more painterly treatment of the work, this album is unusual in the attention given to object surfaces that differentiate the nature of the materials and effectively create a sense of, and I'm borrowing Jonathan Hayes' word here, of optic touch. There are many surfaces here at play, and where there is a real indulgence in different types of surfaces, where the sitter is taking part in this indulgence of surfaces by either looking at objects or touching objects. Jonathan Hay has argued that from the 16th century onwards, the economic rise of city centre valorized a social hierarchy that not only prompted an economic spectacle of conspicuous consumption, but also shifted how people engage with luxurious goods itself. The significance of the experiential encounter also generated hierarchies of material importance. For example, certain materials carried with them symbolic value linked to the place of origins, such as a stone may have come from Duan, which is a place in Guangzhou, or jade from Burma. And these symbolic values added to the pleasure of beholding. At times, the symbolic power of origins transcended an object's actual thingness, thus allowing a layperson to exact as much pleasure from knowing where an item originated as a connoisseur might derive from an erudite encounter with it. It also placed emphasis on materiality as part of this experience of things, and by extension, the painting of objects was one way in which a layperson can delight in things without actually possessing the object in one's hands. Following this line of argument, I will propose that the Peabody Essex Museum album shows an urban workshop artist's approach to creating an aesthetic response that is aligned with how objects are admired. I'm arguing that the painter is trying to capture a similar register of experiential effect, not only to show off the objects on display, but also to some degree become part of that same aesthetic experience, and that these images operated in the in-between world of paintings and objects. In part, this was practical for the maker of export art paintings, as there was not yet a market for this type of works on paper, but a very large one for objects. As with any form of tastemaking, it involves more than one genre of expressions, and text is, as always, an important part of this. In China, the cultural arbiter of taste are the literary men, the ones who belong to the scholarly world rather than the commercial world. And again, we have this Guangdong Canton split that is often to be taken as a firm line of differentiation between these two worlds. However, a type of text that became increasingly important in the 18th century belonged to the world of what we called Kaozhong scholarship, or evidential studies, that also developed methods of historical philology employed investigations of local histories and local geographies. And this rise of interest in local geographies is really part of a much larger transregional culture of knowledge. Guangdong took part in this particular type of knowledge making. In Guangdong, one of the most interesting and early books written at the beginning of the 18th century is by a local scholar, this guy, Chu Dajun. And he's an interesting figure in himself in that he was an anti-Manchu and that he was anti the Qing government. And in fact, he had joined a campaign that fought and failed. And as a result of that, he was spared his life, but his poems, and he was a fantastic poet, many of his works was actually then banned. But what wasn't banned is his book. And the book in question is one called New Comments on Guangdong. This book is composed of 28 chapters and includes comments on food, ships, birds, tomb inscriptions, insects, and ends with strange events. The 15th chapter is a comment on trade goods. And chapters are always organized in terms of importance. Chapters 11 and 13 are on literary arts. I can't remember what chapter 14 is, and I should know. But it's followed then by trade goods. What is actually really interesting is that it's placed far more ahead of ancient ritual vessels, which is often considered to be prized embodiments of learning. So trade goods somehow made a rank as being much more important than that. And it speaks to his much more iconoclastic approach to thinking about history. Within his chapter on trade goods, he lists 25 groups of products classified largely by materials such as gold, precious stones, shells, tribute goods, and other objects. Among these, he includes 5 different groups of fabric: cotton, hemp, common silk mix, feathered cloth, and silk. Throughout the book, Chu focuses on the wealth of raw regional materials and on the high quality of local production. Chu rates the quality of cotton from southern China to be the highest of quality within the land, and then uses rather common fabric with poetic descriptions, extolling the beauty of its tight weave, how it was white as snow and light as silken paper. He maps the many forms of fabric made from natural fibers, such as from hemp to textiles made out of banana leaves, and lists all the different varieties made in different areas of Guangdong, including those made by smaller communities who live on boats or those in the more tribal areas in hilly, remote regions. For silk, he examines the different types from other regions, but really he's trying to concentrate on how Guangdong is in some ways better than the others. So this is the poem that he wrote. State merchants fight to board the foreign ships. The Shizimen, Macau, is open to 2 oceans. 5-thread silks, 8-thread silks, and Guangdong common silk are good. Silver money piled up in the Shizantang, the 13 companies. This is the first record that we have identifying the foreign companies in Guangdong, Canton. So this is the first reference we actually have of Canton itself in Chinese. Given the limitations of time I have it, let me just point out one thing, is that the 5-thread and the 8-thread silks are essentially silks that's made from outside of Guangdong. They're probably Suzhou. They don't really talk about where they are, but they're non-Canton or non-Guangdong produced silks. So he's really talking about how the Guangdong common silk is the better ones, even though the 5-thread and 8-thread are traditionally seen as the much better, higher quality ones. A second point to note is Guangdong is seen as the contact point between 2 maritime routes. One was the West Ocean route, which had direct trade with Europe. The other was the East Ocean that carried Guangzhou, Macau, Nagasaki, but also Guangzhou, Manila as well. In other words, Canton dealt with more than one sea route. Regional production also meant regional competition with other urban centres that produced silk, wood, glass and ceramics, and contributed to the emergence of a general style associated with Guangdong. In general, regardless of material, there was a distinctive Guangdong style, a greater interest in creating intricate and rich effects enhanced by the use of precious stones and other materials. The visual impact is always one of elaborate intensity, and this type of treatment was not only an indicator of opulence, but also visualized technology as a cultural force. There is evidence of this interest in new technology here. The 2 potted plants, which is actually the object, I've kind of cut off, there's 2 there. The 2 potted plants included a blue Jun vase, glaze vase, a type of Qing production in earlier and more classical styles of blade surfaces made at local kilns, which employed 2 layers of glazes that helped intensify the color. It's actually this type of work. In the Peabody, the bright blue glaze is known with its speckled effect may well have been one of these Yeewan vases. But it is textiles that dominate this album. Here we see the depiction of a young girl. Her fan is open to reveal a delicate branch of flowers, a fitting subject for a beauty. Its open form echoes the unfolded feathered tail of the peacock at her feet, which is also meant to draw attention to extraordinary details of her clothing, including her embroidered collar. Chu Daijun also speaks about this in his section of feathered textiles found in Guangdong. He writes, quote, "There are also peacock feathers that are spun into threads, and there are applied embroidery manuals, cloud collars, and sleeve openings." So that's what we're seeing here on her dress itself. Her eyes are won over by its gold and jade blue colors, and it is possible to take delight in it. Chu, being both a literary iconoclast, ends his comments with a short note that the cost of one set of peacock feathers is 1 piece of gold. Textiles is an important part of this section, often forming some of the longest sections, especially of ordinary fabrics, as I've said earlier. And part of the reason is that Guangdong practiced a rather unusual method of sericulture, involved planting mulberry trees on embankments next to fish ponds, and which produced a closed ecosystem where the waste from the ponds fertilized the trees, and the trees provided food for the fish. With the growing demand for silk, many enterprising farmers converted rice paddies into embankments and ponds, and by the end of the 18th century, many suburbs in Guangdong had dedicated a majority of their land to this profitable cash crops. Indeed, there was so much land devoted to this particular type of practice that there wasn't enough rice paddies, and Guangdong actually had to import a lot of its rice from outside. Textile production was therefore not only an important part of Guangdong's history, it became, in the 18th century, an essential economic engine. If the attention to textiles was one of the significant aspects of this album, at times it was too much. This is evident in quite a few. There's about 4 pages at least, including this one of a Ming imperial consort, where the entire surface is covered in various patterns and materials, from the woven carpet to the silk gowns to the stone dragon screen, the ornate red beans with the gold decorations. Imperial consort's social political role is not emphasized by her physical presence, but rather through the overwhelming portrayal of the court as a bedazzled place. The woman in the picture acts more as a device to showcase the many different textile surfaces on display as well. Looking more carefully, the pattern composed of naturalistic forms and abstract shapes have a similar rhythmic energy that is shared across objects. There is an incredible sense of layering that ultimately generates a form of disconnections, not only of information, also between objects. The page swims with overwhelming units of patterns, which, even as it destabilizes the spatial cohesion of the room, gains in spectacle display. One can speculate that one of the reasons why so many of the images are set in interior spaces in this album in general is that it readily provided a surface that allowed units of spaces, architectural spaces, to perform as a form of display case for these particular surfaces. In the 18th century, Guangdong embroidery, so here's another version of it. I really want to concentrate on this idea of excessiveness, and it's such a feature and character of Guangdong craftwork that I really think I want to think a little bit more of what excessiveness means. In the 18th century, Guangdong embroidery, keep slipping between Mandarin and Cantonese, was identified by the use of innovative materials, such as peacock feathers, as we have seen, but also the use of gold threads to create strong outlines that are often slightly raised and which separated the many bright, colourful zones to create strong contrast. This one's less strong. This is actually a slightly later one. I couldn't find a mid-18th century embroidery. I'm working on that at this moment in time. In effect, this type but it wasn't only just embroidery. One of the biggest areas actually also in carving. And Guangdong was particularly known for its woodwork carving and furniture in general. In carving, the effect was to create a highly patternized surface with layered effects, especially of auspicious motifs. And what we see here is chow chow carving, which was particularly popular among local elite. And there were many clan houses that were decked with screens such as that we see on up on the screen at the moment. Related to these, and also increasingly important, are high-end luxury object was Guangdong furniture. In Qing China, and in particular from 1721 onwards, the number of Guangdong furniture increased in tribute lists that was sent from Guangdong to the Qianlong Emperor. To give one example and to choose a date close to our album, in 1747, the provincial governor of Guangdong presented an entire set of a jitan platform, a type of wood, with a throne and a screen, 12 imperial chairs, a pair of bookcases, and a pair of glass mirrors. In the same year, the viceroy of Guangdong and Guangxi presented a carved throne, an imperial desk with carved dragons and clouds, a set of screens with 3 folds of glass panels, a pair of side tables with carved patterns, a calm bed, 12 imperial chairs, a pair of cabinets, a pair of mirrors, a pair of large desks, and large side tablets. I can go on. The appeal of Guangdong furniture led to a workshop within the imperial Forbidden Palace, which was dedicated to making Guangdong-style furniture itself. So there was a separate workshop specifically for this regional type, as opposed to the other furniture workshop, which was far more just everyone else. The scholar Yang Boda argues that we see a shift in taste at the Qing court from the delicate Suzhou style to this more sumptuous style of Guangdong. It is rare indeed to find any furniture articles without carving from the mid-18th century, and almost half the cost of furniture production went into the carving itself. In other words, these are conspicuous works of labor and material. What is depicted, in other words, is also quite general, auspicious images, stories, and sometimes of figures. But what was far more important was the dense appliques of inlays, including copper, glass, enamel, kingfisher, feather, as we see here. I'm almost done. This aesthetic of excessiveness is one that I think defines Guangdong, and which is picked up by the craft industry. There are numerous tales of how excessive Guangdong is within the Chinese literature, literary and scholarly texts, and in particular of merchants and their lifestyles. Sometimes these texts will actually also carry with it negative connotations, particularly if they're written by outsiders visiting Guangdong. But what will happen is that local literary texts would then take over and appropriate these ideas, these what was originally seen as these very negative connotations, and turn them into positive attributes. To give you an example of this, I end with this particular poem. And this is an interesting poem, which was actually written, and it's a very long poem, and it's really about the destruction of the factories during one of the big fires that happened in 1740. There was one in 1743. There'll be another one in 1823. As we can see from this particular poem, and I'll let you read this yourself, is that it is a poem that describes things that are piled up, of people crammed like fish scales. And this particular phrase of being piled and packed like fish scales was one of the many negative things that were actually said about Guangdong, which now they've appropriated as a positive thing in this particular poem. And goods stacked high like mountains. And mountains themselves have very positive attributes within the world of within the Chinese literary worlds. So now things that are good, all these consumerism, these products to be traded, are now represented as as a motif that's highly prized. In other words, it evokes a landscape that privileged things, where the excessive world of trade and consumption itself becomes an aesthetic effect. So let me wrap up. This is summarize what I have presented so far. What I have hoped to have shown, and which I will carry on working on, is a larger Chinese cultural network of material, of knowledge, skill, and aesthetic sensibility that extends beyond the China-West market. One important part of this second network is how it fits into the making of a regional identity that challenged the idea of Guangdong as a place on the margins, even as it positions itself as a place on the margins itself by this way of appropriating what had been a negative image of itself. But as a site, it also sought to exploit its marginality of being a producer of things, where its history as a port city that goes back to the very beginnings of China itself, where the comings and goings of the exotic were, if not the norm, at least characteristic enough to form a local identity with a long history that could be translated into aesthetic terms and into a craft trade. My starting point, however, there was a Guangdong Canton, feels increasingly like a trick question of whether it was ever possible to see these as two separate units or two separate sites of production. I know that I have not quite yet reached a firm conclusion yet, but hopefully I am much closer to one. Thank you. Sorry, it's a little long.
No, that's all right. We have at least 15 minutes.
Okay.
So, the album itself,
Yes.
does it have any other text
No.
other than these cartouches?
Only the cartouches itself, and the text, the Chinese text, no, but it does have the descriptions at the front as well, which is very telling. And just by the listing of its information is very useful itself.
I was quite struck with the first picture you showed about this Taoist nun.
Yes.
It looks identical to the beauty that you had a few
Yes.
slides later. And
I'm not quite sure how to work this. Okay, I can do this.
Go
Right?
back in the,
Anyway, my question was,
Could this?
who wrote these labels? And you said the person who translated them wasn't quite sure how to translate them, but I'm wondering
Whether he
the
wrote
person
them.
yeah, he might have written them because.
I'm not sure. I don't think he wrote them. The reason why I don't think he wrote them is in part because there must have been, someone like him would have written them, and they would have come with the original set, because there were some that were missing when he was looking at them, and he couldn't actually. Part of the reason why York wanted to find out more about these particular figures was that he also wanted to identify the ones that were missing, and those weren't available, so, which would suggest that these red slips were originally there. And you often see these little red slips attached to these particular images itself, but they often do get lost. They are literally just glued on by using rice.
Oh, so I see. They're not part of the.
They would not have been part of the original. So whether they were added during the time of the production of the picture, so whether this is even a Taoist nun itself is up for grabs.
I don't think it's a Taoist thing. She looks like a Mingren.
She does, doesn't she? But it starts off as a Taoist nun as part of it. And is one of the few that is recognized, but I don't think she's a Taoist nun. It's also kind of interesting because there's one which is a Buddhist. That's a Buddhist nun. Or a Buddhist monk. I can't remember if it's a monk or a nun. So they have, what is quite interesting, that clearly some of these images were made as pairs, because there's a lot of male and female roles that are connected, like a Ming king, a Ming empress. There's a Buddhist nun, a Taoist nun, there may be a Buddhist monk. There is a pairing that's going on here as well.
Question?
Yes.
The poem from
Yes.
the end, the Luo Kanchi,
Yes.
made me think of Clunis's book about superfluous things.
Yes.
And I'm wondering, is there a kind of bleed from the discourse about collecting on the individual level, the ethical level, to applying the same language to places?
Is there a similar ethics of collecting that was applied to
Well, if you look at the
places?
poem, it's really, it's the language you could use to describe a collection,
Yes.
right? But now no longer applied to an individual with his collection, but to a place and a kind of the collective collection.
Oh, that's an interesting. I haven't thought about a collective of place. There's certainly a lot of. There are ways that poems itself of different regions, of different parts of it, there's a hierarchy of place within a particular body. So within Guangdong, there'll be different hierarchies of place, which will also go with this idea that place itself can belong to a sort of collection of things, right? Of collection of places. Is that what you're talking about?
Not really. I'm actually thinking that this kind of entrepot
Oh,
involved in luxuries is a kind of instantiation of a type of individual, but now blown onto a larger scale, and brings with it a lot of the moral ambiguities, pros and cons of the whole notion of superfluous things.
there isn't enough judgment call made about these particular. There's actually not that many poems about these particular areas written by these persons. They're not poems. There's a lot of description of text, and that belongs then to a very different kind of writing of things, or writing about things. And the type of textual writings that we get in Chinese, often about this place, tends to be less about things. So this is actually rather unusual, this text, where they actually do make a list of things. And it's also and it's a poem that includes things in it. I have to think a bit more about that, but I don't know. I think that's my honest answer was I don't know whether there is a similarity that's going on here with what Craig was writing about in superfluous things. But it's a good question. I'll think about it a bit more. I'm not sure.
But there is the whole genre of linking places and things through literature on tribute in general, starting with tribute. So the local products identify all the local products of a specific place as. But
they're of raw material mostly, as opposed to of things. Things of raw material that's then turned into things. Because tribute lists itself belong to a different type of text writing. which doesn't belong to the literary world. That belongs to the world of the officials, and that's a different kind of text that's going on there. And I don't know how much of that kind of text then will actually intercept with the collecting habits, because Guangdong itself was a very big collector place, but people weren't collecting these things. They were collecting a lot of other things. But what they were collecting and what they loved to collect were things that were often seen as being, that other places would consider to be strange. So artists, they were very proud of the fact that they collected an artist called Shi Tao, who's now very big, but at that time was actually a very marginal figure within the 18th century world because he was seen as a very strange person. So they had this penchant for collecting strange things, but they never collected export art, or they would never write about collecting export art. They would never write about these kind of things rather than as a collection. There were things that happened, there were things that were there, there are historical things, they belong to geographies and histories, and that world didn't intersect with the more poetic literary world. They were seen as a very different genre. That's why I'm not quite sure how I can, I'm still thinking about how
But
these
sort of like, well, if I asked the question a different way, if I said, what was the contemporary attitude, 18th century, to export art?
What would be the 18th century?
Chinese attitude to export art? Was it viewed as lower quality than stuff produced for Chinese people? Was the taste?
It was a place of it was curious. It was curiosity. It was part of a spectacle of things, and we don't have enough. We don't know how much people collected because there's not enough written about that particular thing. But we do know that people were very curious about going to see these strange things. So we do know, for example, we have, and again it's very anecdotal, and they collected Western paper. To say they found Western paper, they collected Western paper. But we don't actually know what they did with that paper, or whether it was just a raw material paper. There was an interest in glass, but they didn't collect it. They kind of talked about it, but didn't say that they actually purchased it and held it. But there was knowledge of it.
But you're talking about what you just said, were Chinese people collecting Western objects. Did Chinese people collect Chinese export art? By definition, presumably not. Because this is about Europeans'
I'm trying to think what would be Chinese
warehouses
export
full of
art.
Chinese things.
Right.
So is it, morally speaking,
Would you have these things?
would you look down on this if you were Chinese?
Well, people will write that they would look down at this. There's a lot of negativity driven towards these kind of art for sure. But that doesn't necessarily mean that people didn't have them. And that's where I think the ambiguity comes in for me. And that's why I'm not quite sure how to answer the question, because they said they hated it, or they're not necessarily hated it. They thought it was just over the top. This is extravagant. Or it's kind of a little gaudy. It's not as elegant as the Suzhou stuff. They would talk about it that way. But they would also have. Then you'll see them going there and visiting it. It's part of a trade. If you were doing a big trip around China, you have to go to Guangdong. You have to go and see these things. So there is that sort of ambiguity towards it, which is where that's why I'm not quite sure how to answer yours, because I think they're struggling with it as well. I mean, I think they can deal with it as a strangeness and part of it in exotica, but they don't actually necessarily. How far that strangeness can go into the inner world, I think, is the part which I can't gauge. That's why I'm not quite sure how to answer that question yet.
So is this poem a travel poem, sort of a travel writing type poem?
This poem itself is really, it's a historical events poem. So it's really around, because it was a fire. Whenever there's a large fire, there's always a bunch of works that would then come out talking about the fire. And that's the time when you will get things being written about, because it was such a big deal for these giant fires to happen in Guangdong, and it happened, and it led to lots of different changes within these little areas, such as introduction of fire engines, etc., etc. But and you'll start seeing paintings of fire.
Because if you didn't know that,
you wouldn't.
It reads like some kind of a description of Guangzhou as a cosmopolitan town.
Yes.
For the interested tourist or something.
Yes, I mean, I think you do start seeing, this is slightly early, but you do see by the time you get to the 18th century, and that's kind of what I was saying, is that it becomes part of a Chinese tourist itinerary. You go to Guangdong to see this, and you end with it, and you have to go see the cannons. You have to go and see the boats where they're coming in. The cannons in particular was the thing that everyone had to go and see. And you start, but you have it in text. You don't necessarily see that many pictures. There is an unusual picture of it by a Chinese in a Chinese travel book, but you don't actually get necessarily see anything more than that. But it does read like a travel. A lot of these things, because they all belong to that genre of geography, right? So they become sort of in that in-between world of local geographies that is talking about, in many ways, tourist travel sites.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for a wonderful talk. I was really curious about the regional identity of Guangdong people. So I'm wondering, do we know anything about how the local Cantonese, they feel about their role as like an agent between Eastern and Western interaction?
This is where the two separate worlds is very clearly done. There's a lot of writing about how they saw themselves as being Guangdong, but they did not see themselves as being an agent between East and West. They saw themselves far more as an agent between lots of other things. They saw themselves as an agent with the court in particular. They saw themselves as an agent with Suzhou. They saw themselves as an agent with Southeast Asian trade. They did not see themselves as merely that. But most of the time, they saw themselves as being Guangdong, that which was different from the rest of China. You got to understand, the rest of China thought very poorly of Guangdong. It's still true today. There's a north-south split that is as evident then as it was now, as it is now, right? So there was a lot of sort of reactive poems and things about their own identity itself, but it was very much centered, and it strongly echoed the same kind of work that was being written in Suzhou and everywhere else. They didn't really talk about the West so much. Or they didn't position themselves as Guangdong West. There was no such thing as East-West, China-West. That China-West thing comes much, much later in late 18th century. It only comes much later after the Opium War. When the Opium War comes about, that's when it becomes very strong, because they get very angry with the Manchu, the Qing emperor, for not defending them against the West.
Could
Yes.
I ask to that point, would the sort of perspectival nature of the interiors
Yes.
of those scenes have been recognised in China as a Western import, as a stylistic Western import, or was it completely absorbed?
Oh, it's completely absorbed by this time. And it wasn't, and actually the whole perspective thing is actually very interesting. It's by this time it's already very much part of it. The one which is considered to be different is the 1 point perspective, and that was seen as actually very odd and strange. But that sort of multi-perspective one, that's already very much absorbed. So that 1 point perspective was what was considered to be an unusual sort of way of thinking about compositions. But what is so interesting about perspective itself is that Western writing on Chinese art, they always talk about how Chinese don't know perspective, right? It becomes this thing that they have to latch onto. But then they always say, oh, they can't do it, they can't paint it. But then they will talk about, but I bought all these paintings anyway, because actually they're rather good at painting portraits.
It's the same argument between northern and southern Renaissance.
Yes, but I think that perspective, Wayne, is also a way of actually, I think it expresses a certain anxiety, because it becomes actually far more pronounced as we develop, especially when oil painting developed in Canton art as well. I think it registers a particular anxiety that actually here are artworks that actually look a lot like what we produce, and in fact they're getting into the Royal Academies as well, especially oil portraits by artists who follow Chinnery. And you start seeing that idea of the perspective coming in far more in later texts than you do in earlier texts.
Any other questions, comments? Well, in that case, let us thank again.
Thank you.